Section 8 of Margaret of Angoulême, Queen of Navarre, by Agnes Mary Frances Robinson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 6. The Captivity, 1525, Part 1. Left a captive in the tents of Charles, Francis looked toward every state in Europe and saw no hope of succor. England was against him. Spain, Austria, Italy, Germany were his enemies. Drawing his ring from his finger, Francis sent it as a sign to Soliman the Magnificent, Sultan of Turkey. The first messenger was murdered on his way, but the ring was finally obtained by Ibrahim, the brilliant vizier of the Sultan, who wore it in triumph. The second ambassador, a certain Frangipani, was immediately dispatched. He bore a letter and messages from Francis to Soliman, and returned secretly with the Sultan's answer. Thus a secret understanding began between France and the East, by the terms of which trade was to be encouraged between the two countries. Soliman promised that the Christian creed should be respected as his own. A French consul was appointed at Alexandria. While more than all this, it was agreed that Soliman should attempt to win the Hungarian frontier of the empire, thus harassing Charles in the east and giving room for the development of France in the west. But before any result could come of this alliance, Francis must be free. Soliman in his letter bids him not despair. It is not strange that great kings should be captive, and he adds, "My horse is always saddled, and my sword by day and night is girded on." But it is difficult to see how Soliman could rescue the royal captive unless by invading Hungary he could call Charles and his enemies from Madrid and leave Spain open to a French invasion. Such plans were vague and audacious, and the present misery very real. The king was taken from Lombardy and sent to Madrid. Meanwhile, panic reigned in his kingdom. Notwithstanding the poverty and division of the emperor's camp, it still seemed possible to abandon France, that Bourbon, the traitor, might enter in and ravage her. Religious discord increased. The party of Luther and the clerical party each attributed the sorrows of France to the corruption or the impiety of the other. In this year the first burnings began, and under the influence of Cardinal Duprat, Louisa the Regent showed herself implacable toward the Reformation. The Parliament wrote to her representing "the inconveniences which may arise from the heresies which pullulate throughout this realm," and trials were instituted against Lefebvre, Caroli, and Roussel. These were with difficulty rescued by Margaret, who procured an autographed remission of their process from her brother. Francis commanded Parliament to entreat the accused as personages of great knowledge and men of letters and doctrine. But the danger was still so great that Roussel and Lefebvre fled to Strasbourg, and henceforth corresponded under feigned names, only known to the initiated. Danger, however, only increased the fervour of the reformers, and from their exile they influenced the current of thought in France. The misery of earth helped to quicken the impulse toward heaven. "The farther they take you from us," writes Margaret to her brother in May, on the eve of his journey to Spain, "the more increases in me the firm hope that I have of your deliverance and speedy return. For at the time when human wisdom fails and is troubled, then the master work of our Lord is wrought, for it is He alone who will have the glory and the honor." So in these early days of the captivity, France awaited a miracle in favor of her king. His captivity had revived all the enthusiastic devotion of his people. Amadis for chivalry, Absalom for beauty, Ogier for courage, so the popular ballads of the moment portray him. The fight he made on foot alone against his captors of Pavia inspired a host of songs. Son cheval fut tué, là on vit Olivier, Roland aussi Richard, demenant leur métier, combattant tout à pied, comme acteurs troyanois, ont-elles non sorti du bon nom de Valois. Through the whole civilized world, his captivity shed a brighter lustre on the chivalry of Francis. England classed him with Richard, her troubadour par excellence, France with Charlemagne, and with John the Good, her paragons of honor. And Soliman himself, writing to the king in prison, reminds him that Bajazet, the hero of Turkey, suffered a like misfortune. But it was above all in Spain, in the land of his captivity, that the cult of Francis reached its most fantastic heights. The Spaniards, instinct with romance, chivalry, respect for heroic misfortune, saw their ideal in this flimsy and volatile Francis. Thrown by the Austrian Charles, always a foreigner to all his subjects, into a dark, unsightly prison, the French king inspired a reverent pity in the generous heart of Spain. From the lowest to the highest, the nation was interested in the illustrious captive. The family of the Duke of Infantado received a caution from the Emperor, offended by their enthusiasm. "Persons of great standing," writes Margaret later, "desire nothing more than the return of the Emperor to Italy, and then you would not long be left in prison." Ximena dell'Infantado fell so passionately in love with the royal captive that on his betrothal to another in 1526 she entered the religious life. And indeed Francis had never conquered so many hearts by his magnificence as yielded now to his misfortunes. Charles found himself in the position of a jailer, keeping his captive against the popular desire. The fret and annoyance of such a position hardened his heart. He behaved ungenerously to the prisoner, who was none the less his equal, his rival, his companion in arms. With no dislike to Francis, for whom indeed he ever had a contemptuous affection, he made his prison as dreary, as uncomfortable as possible, thinking thus speedily to exact from him the surrender of Burgundy. But Francis, for all his volatile spirit, had a certain fineness of disposition, a certain real chivalry under his Amadis airs and graces. He refused to grant the Emperor's terms, although as the year drew on the Alcazar became, in the sultry summer weather, an intolerable exchange for Fontainebleau. Still Francis refused to dismember his kingdom, growing a little weaker every month in his unaccustomed restraint, and attaining much facility in making verses the one amusement of his dreary prison. Naturally, this heroic obstinacy increased yet further his popularity in Spain. The Emperor's sister, the young widow of the King of Portugal, shared the universal passion. Leonor of Austria was at this moment about 26 years of age, not regularly beautiful, yet her face, preserved to us by a painter of Clouet school, far exceeds in interest and charm the more regular beauties of her day. A thin face, delicately sharp in outline, a hatchet face it might be called unkindly, is set in bushy masses of crisp hair, whose reddish gold is wonderfully clear and beautiful in tint. The face, too, is fresh and fair in color, a charming half-boyish face with its shock of blonde hair and eager chevaleresque expression, an ardent face with the Austrian lip modified to the self-willed, resolute pout of a spoiled girl, not brooking hindrance to her generous impulses. Yet this ardent blonde, with her look of chivalrous naivete, her brilliant hair and clear rosy color, her full lips and alert romantic air, has the dreamy, impassive, light brown eyes, the thin, finely arched, jet-black brows of a quite different type. There is something odd, unmatched, inharmonious, yet not unpleasing in this brilliant face, with the dull and dreamy gaze, something which tells us that this grandchild of the fiery Maximilian was the daughter of the mad Juana. She had already played her romance, this quick-blooded Austrian Spaniard, who represented all those qualities of their mixed race which her brother Charles ignored. In her girlhood, in her Flemish home, under the wing of her aunt, the politic Margaret, she had met a handsome, stalwart German, the fair-haired Palatine Frederick. The two young people had fallen violently in love with each other and kept their passion a secret for some months. But finally some well-informed prime minister got a hint of it, and the wayward Leonor was married against her will to a dissolute old dotard, the King of Portugal. On his death the Palatine Frederick renewed his offers, but Leonor had already heard of her brother's captive, the Ogier, the Amadis, the Roland of France. She turned a deaf ear to her faithful Palatine. Leonor had been promised by her brother to the Constable Bourbon. She refused to wed the traitor who had ruined her hero. Her frank, expansive nature did not seek to hide her interest. She writes to Louisa, "Would that it were in my power to deliver the King." And seeing Leonor so devoted, a new condition of peace began to be mooted in the court of Louisa at Lyons. A letter exists, of which the signature is quite illegible, dated the 2nd of June, 1525, and addressed to Louisa. Here the new plan is formulated for, I think, the first time. It is proposed that Leonor shall be given in marriage not to Bourbon but to Francis, that her daughter by her first husband be married to the young Dauphin, that the Duchess Margaret wed the Emperor, and Constable Bourbon the Princess Renée. On this plan the Duchy of Burgundy might be reserved for the eldest son of Leonor and Francis. This would, however, dismember the Dauphin's inheritance. On the 6th of June, Madame, who was regent in France, sent an embassy to Madrid to treat of the marriage of Leonor with Francis and of the Dauphin with her daughter. But all the other conditions of peace waited the arrival of Madame d'Alençon, for it was now determined that the Duchess Margaret should visit her brother at Madrid and solicit the Emperor on his behalf. The arrival of Madame Marguerite, writes Brion in July from Venezuela, will decide the deliverance of the King. After some delay, the Emperor sent a safe conduct to Margaret, and she prepared for her adventurous journey. Many mistrusted the integrity of Charles and feared that he might invent some pretext to detain her as a hostage. Diu vuole che la fin sia come lo principe, God grant that the end be no worse than the beginning, wrote at this moment a citizen of Marseille, and many feared other perils less august. The highway robbers who then infested the less travelled portions of France and Spain. The season, too, was signally unhealthy, hot, with violent storms and thunder. But Margaret disregarded all these things. She was to see her brother again and to do him a service. Much was indeed hoped for this journey, much expected from the influence of Margaret upon the Emperor. At another moment she might have shrunk from petitioning the man who had not yet answered the proposals which gave her to him in marriage. But during this long, tedious journey she was subject to an access of exaltation, such as in times of great danger and difficulty she had experienced before. She seemed impervious to any thought but one, that she was nearing her captive brother, and as needles do not hurt the tender flesh of tranced women, nor tortures reach the sense of martyrs in their hour of crowning, so neither bodily discomfort nor wounded pride touched the feeling of Margaret at this moment. On her road toward Madrid, a fortnight's journey then from the frontier, she sent frequent letters to her brother. "I implore you," she cries, "to believe that whatsoever I can do in your service, were it to scatter to the winds the ashes of my bones, nothing would be to me either strange or difficult or painful, but consolation, repose, and honor. And at this hour, my lord, I well know what strength of love our Lord has put in us three. For that which seemed to me impossible, thinking only of myself, is easy in the memory of you, and this makes me desire for your good things which the pains of death should not have made me wish for my own repose." On her slow and painful way, Margaret was met by dreadful news. The king was very ill. The hot summer weather and close confinement had brought him to death's door. The news spread like wildfire, causing a thrill of horror in France. The Dauphin was but 7 years old, and a long regency seemed to threaten the exhausted nation. News came, says the bourgeois of Paris, that the king was dead, captive, in a town called Madril, whence great trouble and sorrow arose among the people of Paris and throughout the land of France, and this lasted nigh a month. Meanwhile, Margaret hastened her journey toward her dying brother. In her litter, as she went, she wrote songs about him. Le désir du bien que j'attends me donne de travail matière. Une heure me dure 100 ans, et me semble que ma litière ne bouge ou retourne en arrière, tant j'ai de m'avancer désir. Oh, quelle est longue la carrière, où la fin giste mon plaisir. Je regarde de tous côtés pour voir s'il arrive personne. Prions sans cesser, non douter, Dieu que santé à mon roi donne. Quand nul ne voit, l'œil j'abandonne, à pleurer puis sur le papier, un peu de ma douleur j'ordonne, voilà mon douloureux métier. Oh, qu'il sera le bienvenu, celui qui frappant à ma porte, dira le roi est revenu, en sa santé très bonne et forte. Alors la sœur, plus mal que morte, court à baiser le messager, qui telle nouvelle apporte, que son frère est hors de danger. But no messenger came to win Margaret's embraces by such welcome news. The king sank lower and lower. An abscess had formed on the crown of his head. The body, already wasted by fever, could scarcely support this additional cause of weakness. On Monday, the 18th of September, Francis was so ill that his attendants sent for the Emperor, who all this time had never visited his ailing captive. Charles was really shocked when he heard that his rival lay a-dying. He travelled all the next day from Segovia to Madrid. It was dark when he reached the Alcazar, where Francis was confined. Charles dismounted, leaving his cortege outside, lest their presence should fatigue his prisoner. The Viceroy of Naples and Anne de Montmorency met him at the gate, lighting the way with torches. So they reached the unprincely room where the most magnificent prince in Europe lay dying on his prison bed. Seeing the Emperor enter, Francis tried to raise himself on his elbow, but Charles, who after all was still a young man with a natural heart, threw himself on his knees beside the bed and flung himself into the arms of Francis. So for a long time captive and captor held each other tightly embraced. Then said Francis, who witnessed this affection with some excusable irony, "Sire, you see before you your prisoner and your slave." "Nay," cried Charles with real remorse, "my good brother and true friend whom I hold as free." This was too much for Francis. He looked round the room. "Your slave," he repeated. "My friend who shall be free," repeated the Emperor. So the little scene has been handed down to us. We can imagine to what hopes and desires gave rise these words of Charles, dictated half by generous remorse, half by a desire to keep alive a valuable prisoner. On the morrow Margaret arrived. It was the 20th of September. The Emperor was still at the Alcazar. When the bustle of her attendants announced her arrival, he went downstairs to receive this woman who had been proposed to him as a wife. He found her in the doorway, pale and in tears. She was dressed from head to foot in white, the mourning of a royal widow. he led her still weeping to her brother. When he shut the door on their meeting, he must have remembered that proposal of marriage, and recalled the pale, dishevelled woman he had left. She had had no time to repair the disorders of travel. She was worn with her long, hot journey over rough, unshaded roads. Her beautiful hair and graceful figure were seen at a disadvantage. Her long face with the marked features must have appeared haggard in its grief. At least so much is clear. Charles, who at 25 years old was the most important personage of his age, did not fall in love with this pale and tearful widow of 33, whom he now encountered for the first time. We hear no more of a marriage between him and Margaret. Meanwhile the joy was great between the brother and the sister. For the moment Francis appeared out of danger. But 3 days after, on the 25th of September, the sinking of death appeared to overpower him. Montmorency sent a hurried message to the Emperor, who received with chill resignation the news that his scheming was outplanned by death. "God has given him to me," he exclaimed, "and God has taken him away." Yet he knew that if Francis died, the Battle of Pavia had been bought too dearly. End of Section 8. Section 9 of Margaret of Angoulême, Queen of Navarre, by Agnes Mary Frances Robinson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 6. The Captivity, 1525, Part 2. Meanwhile, Margaret, in agony and exaltation, knelt praying by her brother's side. Francis lay quite insensible upon his bed, but none the less his sister had an altar dressed in his cell, and sent for the Archbishop and his priests to say a Mass. At the moment of the elevation of the host, the Archbishop turned and spoke to the dying king. Francis opened his eyes and asked for the Holy Sacrament. That evening the abscess broke and immediate danger was over. The king was still very weak, still feverish, and needing better air and greater comforts than his prison could supply. Margaret at once began negotiations for a peace. But now she found the Emperor did not remember the words that had so often been quoted to her. He seemed in no haste to set his good brother free. Margaret was in great distress. Even for her brother's sake, she could not counsel the surrender of Burgundy. And yet, unless she could satisfy Charles, there seemed nothing but perpetual imprisonment for Francis. No other king would come forward as a champion. Soliman as yet had made no sign, nor would he be likely to leave Turkey in the winter, and before another summer came, her brother might be dead. Louisa at home had concluded a peace with Henry of England, but that wary king would only risk his moral support, and to complicate her troubles, Montmorency had become jealous of her influence with her sick brother. She had to warn Francis not to listen to such tales of her as this old and long-loved friend may tell him. "I pray you, my lord," she writes, "keep me in your good graces in spite of Montmorency, who is jealous." Meanwhile, the outer world kept assuring her that she was certain to conclude an advantageous peace. "À vous, madame, l'honneur et la mérite," write the ministers from France in premature congratulation. "Ne fait doute que Madame d'Alençon, votre sœur, conclura toute une bonne paix," writes Charles himself to the king in the letter where he excuses himself from paying further visits to his captive. But Margaret must have suffered many a bitter doubt. She writes to her brother on the road to Toledo, from a village whither she has gone to conduct her business with the Emperor, and her letter before the 13th is full of trouble and of wounded pride. October 1525. "My lord, you will have heard from Monsieur d'Ambron and Babou of the terms they persist in here, which are not like the letters and the kind words which Véret brought you from his master, as you shall know at greater length from their lips. Since their departure the Viceroy has sent me word that in his opinion it were better for me to go meet the Emperor, but I have forwarded him a message by Monsieur de Senlis that I have never yet stirred from my lodging without being sent for, and that when the Emperor chooses to send for me, I am to be found in a certain convent, where at present I have stayed from 1 o'clock till 5, vainly waiting an answer. This is already the 3rd day I have scarcely set my foot outside of convents, and this I have told the Viceroy I shall continue to do, so that the world at large may know that if I do not speak with the Emperor, still my rank requires me not to court his courtiers and tamper with the servants of a master who promised you that I should speak to him alone of your affairs. I shall see this evening what they will do, and tomorrow, having received your commands, I shall follow them as best I can. And I assure you, my lord, that here they are so perplexed and hindered that they greatly fear I shall ask the Emperor's leave to retire, or so I gather from what has been said to the Seneschal and to Senlis, and I fancy that by keeping our heads high a little longer we may force them to speak another language. And come what may, we will deliver you by the grace of God. But I beseech you, since you set so infamously to work, do not trouble yourself about the slow progress we make in bringing them to the point where so greatly desires to arrive. Your Margaret. Finally, on the 13th of October, Margaret was received at Toledo by the Emperor in person, with great politeness, says Ferraras, the Spaniard, but Margaret does not seem so satisfied. She writes to her brother, I found him very cold, je le trouvai bien froid, but not inclined to stand on ceremony, for he put me off on pretext of speaking to his council, and said he would give me an answer today. And then he took me to see Queen Aliénor, his sister, where I stayed until quite late, and last night I went to see her, and she spoke to me in terms of great friendliness. It is true she goes on her journey tomorrow, and I must go and take leave of her. I think she goes more by obedience than by choice, for they keep her very much in order. And as I was talking to her, the Viceroy came in quest of me, and I went to the Emperor's apartments, who sent for me to come to his chamber. And he told me he desired your deliverance and perfect amity, but in the end he stopped at the question of Burgundy. Margaret by this time centred her hopes on the intercession of Leonor. The Emperor's fine speeches, though abundant, covered an iron will, and she learned to put little trust in them. He assures me always, she writes, that he will do a thing that I shall marvel at. But she adds elsewhere, I think they all wish to content me without doing anything in reason. And again, everyone tells me he loves the king, but I have little experience of it. The only way to get at a peace was through Leonor, who might bring Burgundy as a dower. I desire for your good things which the pains of death should not make me wish for my own repose. So Margaret had written to her brother on her journey to Madrid, and now she found herself obliged, perforce, to agree to cruel terms. I assure you, my lord, she writes to Francis, that the office of solicitor in so unreasonable a company is a far more difficult service than it was to be your physician when you were sick. Not until the end of the month was any result obtained from the frequent conferences between Margaret and the Emperor. Then the following conditions were drawn up and sent to the king, things which the bitterness of death should not make me wish for my own repose. The King of France was to resign Burgundy, Auxonne, Mâcon, Auxerre, La Brie, Bar-sur-Seine to the banks of the Somme. To this extravagant demand Margaret would not agree. He was to resign Tournai, Flanders, and Artois. He was to resign all right to Milan and Naples. He was to resign all pretensions to Aragon. Agreed. He was to abandon Henry d'Albret, King of Navarre, Robert de la Marche, and others to the Emperor's justice. Not agreed to by Margaret. He was to marry Leonor, Queen of Portugal, and settle Burgundy on their joint heirs, refused by Charles. Monsieur de Bourbon, his allies and friends, to be reinstated in their former positions, agreed. Such miserable terms were the best to be obtained. With a sore heart must Margaret have watched the couriers set out from Toledo carrying the news to her brother in prison. If he refused this peace, perpetual imprisonment lay before the gayest and most splendid monarch of Europe. If, enfeebled by long captivity, he assented to these conditions, France must perforce descend to the level of a petty state. But when in a few days the couriers returned, her heart must have beat high with glad recognition of her brother's chivalry. His letter ran: Monsieur mon frère, I know you cannot condemn me to perpetual imprisonment more honestly than by asking for my ransom, an impossible thing. On my side, I am resolved to take my prison in good part, being sure that God, who knows I merit it not for long, being the captive of honorable warfare, God will give me strength to bear it patiently, and I have no regret save only the fact that the honest proposals which you chose to hold me to in my illness should be barren of effect. Thus affairs were still in the same state as on the morrow of Pavia. Margaret was now in despair. Ferreras, the Spanish historian, assures us that she undertook to get Francis out of prison in disguise, that she put in his bed a negro who was accustomed to carry the wood to the king's fire, and dressing her brother in the slave's attire, and having blacked his face, attempted to escape with him in the dusk, but was discovered by a groom of the chambers. This may be true, or it may be a mere blundering remembrance of the escape of Henri d'Albret from Pavia, but in either case it was evident there was no rescue for the King of France. In November another scheme began to occupy Margaret and her brother, a scheme by which the Emperor would have left in his hands no king whom a hard captivity might incline to shameful terms, but a simple nobleman whom he could have no interest to misuse. In his prison at Madrid, Francis spent long hours in drawing up the Act of Abdication, by which he renounced the crown of France in favour of his eldest son. In these letters patent, Francis narrates his misfortunes of Pavia, his illness in prison, and the rigour of Charles. He speaks of the journey of Margaret, and how her reasonable efforts were refused. Then he adds that he would rather that he should remain all his lifetime in prison than sever his kingdom of France in pieces. He and his children will pay the price. They are born for the good of my kingdom, true children of the public weal. And France, he reminds his subjects, has been governed well by younger kings with the help of good counsel. He therefore appoints the Dauphin Francis, King of France, under the regency of Madame. In the event of the death of Madame, her place shall be filled by notre très chère et très aimée sœur unique Marguerite de France. But in case of the deliverance of the king, this act and all its contents to be held null and void. History with one voice has attributed the inspiration of this act to Margaret. This one counsel, the cheering cordial of her presence, and the furtherance of a friendship between her brother and Leonor was all she had accomplished in the visit from which she had hoped so much. And now that this visit was at an end, she had incautiously let the 3 months covered by her safe conduct slip toward the close, dreading no treachery on the Emperor's part in her sweet dense reliance on the honour of others. But she was warned in time, either by the suspicion of her brother or by some watchful friend. Tradition records that Constable Bourbon, who had loved this gentle and courageous woman, could not stand by and see her condemned unwittingly to a dreary imprisonment. After many a debate, the legend runs, he at last sent secret word to Francis that if Margaret were not out of Spain by the close of December, the Emperor would consider her his captive. From some source at least she learned her danger at the end of November. By forced marches and unrelaxed haste there was just time to reach home in safety. Margaret set out at once, grieving sore to leave her brother. It was arranged that she should not wait for the act of abdication, which should be brought to France by Montmorency, whose ransom was paid by Francis, and who would leave Spain at the new year. Thus, should she fail to arrive in time, the letters patent would none the less be safe. So, in sore distress of mind, the poor sister departed. All her hopes had come to nothing, all her endeavours had failed. There was still an endless prospect of exile or captivity before the adored brother and king to whom she said adieu, perchance forever. How willingly would she not have stayed behind and shared his prison! But she had a task to perform, another service to render. She must return to France, attend to his affairs, and educate his children. If she let fall her burden, there was the less hope for him. She wrote to Montmorency from Alcalá, the first stage of her journey, on the 20th of November. My cousin, this morning when I awoke I received your letter, and I leave you to think if I was glad to hear news of the king. As for my news, the body is but too well, but the spirit, I cannot deny it, remembers that which is left behind. Do you know that all night long I held the king's hand, and would not rouse myself in the morning so as to have that pleasure a little longer. I tried to take this departure as well as I can, but succour me with news of him as often as you may. Let me hear some good news, if you have any to tell. That morning of discouragement and poignant regret was the first of many such days. She can think of nothing but the brother she has left. She encounters Brion, going with news from the frontier to the king. Would to God, she cries, that it were I returning. My speed would be nowise Brionique. But every day takes her farther and farther away. At last she writes to her brother, whom, after all her pains, she has left unaided, and beseeches him to let her return and share his danger. She writes vaguely and strangely, feeling the risk to Francis if her letters fall into the secret and suspicious hands of Charles. Sire, that which you were pleased to write me, saying you would tell me further, has made me go on, hoping, moreover, that you would not leave the straight road, and flee from them who for all their happiness only desire to see you, though worse off than before. Is this a last prayer to give up Burgundy and be free? Let my intention be prescribed, if you should ever need the honest and ancient service which I have borne and bear to your good grace, and if the perfect imperfection of 100,000 faults make you disdain my obedience, then at least, sire, do not increase my lamentable misery by demanding experience in addition to defeat, knowing my impotence without your aid, as you shall learn further by a sign I send. And I ask for the end of my misfortunes and the beginning of a good new year, only that you may let me be for you some little of that which infinitely you are to me, and will be to me without ending in my thoughts. And awaiting the joy of seeing you and of speaking with you, sire, my desire of meeting presses me to humbly beseech you to let me know the answer by this messenger. And if it be no trouble to you, I will set off at once, feigning another occasion. And there is no stress of weather nor roughness of the roads that will not be turned for me into an exceeding pleasant repose. And I shall be most grateful to you, and yet more grateful if it please you to bury my letters in the fire and my words in silence, else you will render worse than dead my miserable life. Francis had the force to refuse this agonized appeal. He neither called his sister back nor yielded Burgundy. He sent her on to France, and she obeyed, though sick at heart, and shorn of all natural trust in her own efforts, of which you know the impotence without your aid. But since the king commanded it, she travelled on, and on the 15th of December she was home in France. She was in her mother's arms. Back in France at last, and back again without the good news she had gone so far to get, back in a disappointed, weary, restless, and ironic country, back to hear the people singing in the streets, no longer of Ogier and Charlemagne, but a new satirical ballad. Rends, rends-toi, roi de France, rends-toi donc, car tu es pris. Back to confront Parliament with a writ of abdication, and a dissatisfied country with the news of a regency of women. Yet not for lack of striving was her task undone. What else could she have done? Any peace that Charles would grant must of necessity dismember France. And so concludes the bourgeois of Marseille. The said lady returned by land, and she made no good cheer, and not without cause, for she could not agree with the Emperor that her brother should be ransomed by money, but they demanded a portion of the realm, which we could not grant without great loss and dishonour. Dieu per sa pietat nos mande bueno pas. End of section 9. Section 10 of Margaret of Angoulême, Queen of Navarre, by Agnes Mary Frances Robinson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 7, Queen of Navarre, 1525 to 1530. Scarcely had Margaret returned with her mother to Lyons on their slow progress from the frontier to the capital, when they were joined by another fugitive from the Emperor's prisons. Henry d'Albret, the young King of Navarre, had been taken captive with Francis, and since February he had been imprisoned in the fortress of Pavia. Despairing of any deliverance, one moonlit December night he dressed himself in his page's clothes and let himself down from his window into a dried-up moat, leaving his servant sleeping in his bed. The next morning a feeble voice behind the curtain answered the turnkey, whom a second page assured that the king was ill that day, nor till the night was the farce discovered, when the jailer generously pardoned the two devoted pages. Meanwhile their master, a daring lad of 22, escaped as best he might toward France. In tempeste noctis silentio et lunae claritatis favore proa duvante, as a contemporary narrated to Wolsey. On Christmas Eve he reached Saint-Just-sur-Lyon. It was nearly a year since he had breathed freely, and now he was safe in France. He rested there 2 days, whence he wrote to his chancellor to announce his escape, and then he made his way to the court of Louisa. He knew the regent well, for on his mother's death in 1519 the young King of Navarre had been sent to the French court, where Francis had shown great favour to the spirited and clever lad. There, too, he must often have seen Duchess Margaret, then a charming young married woman, the centre of a brilliant court, whom he should now meet in her widowhood, mournful and sick at heart. But if he found her no longer the star of a court, he found her the heroine of Europe. Her embassy, though seemingly fruitless, had at least established her devotion and her address. Charles V declared that he had not thought it possible a woman could speak so well. Young Henry d'Albret, impetuous and always ready to fall in love, gave the reins to his admiration for this brave and tender woman. They had many adventures to tell each other, many an instance of the Emperor's perfidious coldness. Margaret, who ever since her journey into Spain hated Charles with a vigorous hatred strange in that kindly heart, found ample sympathy in Henry d'Albret, to whom the Emperor was not merely an ungenerous captor, but the usurper of his kingdom. Another occasion for friendship lay in the tolerance with which the young king viewed the new ideas of reform. Béarn had never been a narrowly Catholic state. Margaret, often sorely grieved by the cruel intolerance of her brother and the Cardinal de Tournon, must have turned for sympathy to this young Béarnois, who, like herself, dreaded the Inquisition as the deadliest blight that could fall on any kingdom. Thus they had two essential points in common: unity of interests and religious sympathy. For the rest, Duchess Margaret was a charming woman of the world, socially and intellectually the superior of Henry, and she was the sister of the king, whose influence was most necessary to him. He was an impetuous, brave, ambitious youth, sufficiently resembling her knightly ideal to attract her interest, unfortunate enough to command her compassion. He was poor and valiant, he was kind and just to his subjects, and these would be great merits in the eyes of Margaret. That he was headstrong, fickle, and violent was scarcely apparent, and he was so young. He had indeed much in his favour. Had he not been so given to women as he was, says Bordenave, he would have been irreprehensible. He loved his people like his own children. Margaret, listening to all his generous plans on behalf of his subjects, became warmly interested in their ardent and unfortunate young king, and he wished nothing more than to marry the only sister of the King of France. But in this early spring of 1526, Margaret had much to do besides talking with Henry d'Albret. In February, Anne de Montmorency returned to France, his ransom paid, with the news that Francis was concluding a treaty with Charles, to whose sister Leonor he had been formally betrothed on the 12th of February. The approaching release of the king gave great satisfaction in France, but not the joy, the outburst of thanksgiving with which she would have hailed it on the morrow of Pavia. The king's deliverance meant poverty and dismemberment to France, meant the imprisonment of the royal princes, and it was barely 4 months since Francis had sworn that he would rather die in prison than subject her to such disgrace. The king was to be king again, but no longer Ogier, no longer Roland. A note of satire pierces through the songs which the people made about their prince in his hard captivity. Courrier qui porte lettre, retourne-t-on à Paris, et va-t-on dire à ma mère, va dire à Montmorency, qu'on fasse battre monnaie aux 4 coins de Paris, s'il y a de l'or en France, qu'on en prenne à Saint-Denis. Qui le dauphin en amène, et mon petit-fils Henri, etc. There is no conditions he will not grant for freedom's sake. It was not only gold, not only the royal children that Charles demanded, he required the province of Burgundy. And those that surmised the contents of the peace could not know that the king in prison had signed before witnesses 2 secret protests, whereby he declared that a prisoner under lock and key is in no wise constrained to keep a forced obligation. In this month of February, when Montmorency brought the news of the treaty into France, the children who were to be exchanged as hostages for their father were themselves very ill with measles, or so Margaret calls their illness, probably scarlatina, accompanied with long and severe fever. She writes, Monsieur d'Angoulême took it with a very bad fever, and then Monsieur d'Orléans, but he was not so ill, and then Madame Madeleine, but very slightly, and lastly, for company's sake, Monsieur le Dauphin, without either pain or fever. And now they are all quite cured and very well, and Monsieur le Dauphin is doing wonders at his lessons, mixing with his schooling 100,000 other occupations. And there is no more question of flying into passions, but rather of all the virtues. Monsieur d'Orléans, Henry, is nailed to his books, and says he will be good, but Monsieur d'Angoulême, Charles, knows more than the others, and does things which seem rather prophecies than childish play. So much so, my lord, that you would be astonished to hear them. The little Margot is like me, she will not be ill, but here everyone tells me of her wonderful grace, and she becomes prettier than ever was Mademoiselle d'Angoulême. As February passed away and the children recovered, Margaret had to prepare them for the change to come, for the price the 2 elder boys, Francis and Henry, were to pay for their father's freedom. She must have spoken to them of the ardent and chivalric queen, the betrothed of their father, whose wards they were to be. On the 17th of March the exchange was made. The two children were taken to the Bayonne, and thence to the river Bidachoa, between Fontarabia and Andaille, near Saint-Jean-de-Luz. They and their attendants embarked from the banks of Navarre at the same moment as the boat of Francis left the Spanish border. One moment's glimpse in passing, and the two melancholy children, one 8 years old, one 7, were in hostile country, in the hands of the Constable of Castile. One happy, careless glance, and Francis was on the friendly shore, had leaped on his horse and made it prance and curvet as he cried, "Now at last I am a king again." Francis was not yet actually in his own kingdom, but in the territory of that of young King Henry d'Albret, who, with Margaret, was so anxiously waiting his arrival. Francis was at first indignant when he heard of the match that he was required to sanction, for Margaret at this moment was half promised to the Emperor of Germany, to the King of England, and to Constable Bourbon. But in the first moment of his return he would not show himself ungrateful. Many friends awaited him at Bayonne, eager to clasp his hand again. Margaret, happy and well, whom he had last seen so miserable in his prison at Madrid, and Henry d'Albret, his fellow captive at Pavia, now his host. There were also Louisa, his mother, the faithful and politic regent, and Montmorency, who had concluded the negotiations that Margaret had begun. Two women, moreover, eager and fearful beyond the rest, watched the king and watched each other to see which he first would greet. Francis turned at last, and passing by Madame de Chateaubriand without a word, went up to a blonde and handsome Norman lady, Mademoiselle Anne du Heilly de Pislieu, a maid of honor to his mother, a talkative, lively creature suspected of Huguenotism, to whom he had written a letter in verse from Madrid. Now Francis had recovered kingdom, freedom, mother, sister, mistress, and friends, but the price was still to be paid. Not only the ransom of 2 million golden crowns, but the province of Burgundy. As for Burgundy, Francis intended to leave that debt unpaid. He displayed to his Parliament the 2 secret protests that he had made in prison. He called a council of notables at Cognac, who voted unanimously against the separation of their province from the realm of France. The Pope, the Parliament, France at large, approved the non-execution of the treaty. "A captive in bondage," cried Francis, "has no honor and can bind himself to nothing." But if the province was not ceded, a paladin surely would have returned to his prison, even as John of Burgundy returned to London. "Nay," cries Francis, "John found in Edward a generous conqueror, who lodged him in his palace, admitted him to his table, and to all the amusements of his court. Therefore John treated Edward as an equal and a friend. But the Emperor, forgetful of our kinship, forgetting that prisons were made for criminals and not for kings, made me feel all the horrors of a dungeon, and barbarously caused me to despair. How many times have I not told him that I had but the usufruct of my realm, and could not act without my subjects and my laws? But his blind cupidity has taken himself in his own net." The indignation of Charles availed little. Rome, England, Turkey, all sent expressions of their sympathy to Francis. All that Charles could do was to take the French attendants of the little princes and send them to the galleys. As for the children themselves, they were safe in the charge of Leonor. Francis at home was King of France again. King of France, but no paladin of chivalry. Perhaps the worshipping eyes of Margaret, who had so praised him for his deed of abdication, perplexed him now in his royal state at Fontainebleau. Or perhaps he only wished to reward the devoted sister who had dared so much for him. For some reason Francis withdrew his opposition to the marriage of the Duchess Margaret with the King of Navarre. He showered presents and royal promises on his sister and her lover, assuring them that he would reconquer the lost province of Navarre from Spain for Henry d'Albret. The other pretenders to Margaret's hand had all withdrawn. A chill enmity separated Charles from France. Henry of England, preferring the maid to the mistress, had set his lustful heart upon Anne Boleyn. Constable Bourbon, in this very year, was killed while leading his victorious armies to the sack of Rome, and on the 24th of January, 1527, Margaret was married to the young King of Navarre. It was a strange, impoverished, beautiful kingdom to which Henry d'Albret took his bride in the autumn of the year, when they were weary of the festivals of France, a new and almost a foreign country. "I have been here 5 days," says Margaret, writing in October from Béarn, "and I scarcely begin to understand the language." In the north, all round the capital of Nérac, stretched the dreary Landes, wastes of ash-coloured sand, purpled here and there with heather, streaked with dark lines of pine wood and forests of cork oak, ended only by the horizon of the sea, miles of undulating, desolate heath, with here and there cropping the scanty herbage a flock of sheep guarded by a shepherd rudely clad in skins, a strange figure against the sky as he strode over the sand and over the bushes on the enormous stilts that peasants use there. And Pau, the southern capital, was no less different to the placid and splendid courts of France. A high-lying, steep little town, with a small fortress-like castle, and beyond, the white serrated peaks of the Pyrenees, full of robbers then, and of bears and wolves, with all round in the lower hills villages where lived those poor and swarthy peasants whose language Margaret could not understand. For some years she did not love this sharp foreign mountain country. She stayed there but for a month or 2 in the year, fleeing gladly back to Fontainebleau, where her brother was turning the great hunting lodge of the French kings into a summer palace more magnificent than dreams. For home was still to Margaret in France. She had no children in her castle of Béarn. Her little son had died soon after birth. Her daughter, Jeanne, was not quite 2 years old when Francis placed the poor solemn baby in a castle of her own at Plessis-les-Tours, afraid to leave her with her parents, lest Henry d'Albret should betroth her to a prince of Spain. Margaret was childless, and her husband was unfaithful. Still, after a few years' marriage, her thoughts began to turn toward her distant subjects of Béarn. For there was no great need of her at the court of France. Leonor had come from Spain, bringing back the 2 little princes, but she came home to find her husband fickle and unfaithful, and no disappointment is so embittered as that of the disillusioned idealist. The ardent, chivalrous Leonor was a disappointed woman. Still, she had a certain hold upon her husband, though infinitely less than belonged to pretty Anne de Pisseleu, now Duchess d'Estampes, and the king's acknowledged mistress. Francis had these 2 women. Louisa had her son, her political ambition, and her grandchildren. The very children themselves had a new mother. So Margaret began to listen to the impatience of her husband, eager to be back among his own people, dumbly enraged with Francis, who had taken his infant daughter from him. Thus, in the end of the year 1530, it happened that the King and Queen of Navarre went back into their own country and ruled their kingdom from their court of Nérac. End of section 10. Section 11 of Margaret of Angoulême, Queen of Navarre, by Agnes Mary Frances Robinson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 8. Nérac in 1530. Si entrez-vous qui le saint évangile en sens agile annoncé, quoiqu'on gronde, c'est en oreille en refuge et Bastille. Si entrez-vous, dames de haut parage, en franc courage, entrez-y, en bonheur, fleurs de beauté à céleste visage. À droite corsage, à maintien prude et sage, en ce passage est le séjour d'honneur. Si entrez-vous, et bien soyez venus, et parvenus, tout noble chevalier, fricalier, joyeux, plaisant, mignon, en général tout gentil compagnon. So runs the inscription over the door of the Abbey of Thelema. Whether in designing that perfect court whose motto was Fais ce que voudrais, since the virtuous wish nothing else but honor, whose splendor outrivaled Bonnivet or Chantilly, whose library contained all books of Greek, Hebrew, Latin, and French, Spanish, and Tuscan, where Lutheran refugees were received and honored, where all the ladies were noble and honorable, and all the knights were sprightly and joyous, whether in designing this Abbey of Thelema, Rabelais had in mind the little court of Nérac, we cannot here decide. Let us only say that to the Queen of Navarre, esprit abstrait, ravi et estatique, Rabelais dedicated the third book of his Pantagruel, that he was protected by her friends, the three Du Bellets, that he was intimate with Clément Marot, with Étienne Dolet, with Desperriers and Calvin, and others of the persecuted scholars whom she protected. And let us own that much such a court as Thelema was held at the castles of Nérac and Pau, a court of scholars, of poets and thinkers, who fled thither from the stake or from the dreadful convent in Pace, a court of charming women at once good and gay, and of men as light-hearted as the king and as courteous as the queen. Henry and Margaret, early estranged at heart, had one great interest in common, the desire to improve this desolate princedom of Béarn. Henry, at his own cost, drained and cultivated the sandy Landes, planted them with vineyards and cork oak woods, and imported labourers from Saintonge. Henry built a great cloth mill, and taught his subjects how to weave the fine Pyrenean wool they sheared from their mountain herds. Henry established courts of justice throughout his kingdom, and reformed the ruin and disorder into which the whole land had fallen, and Margaret rebuilt the castles of Nérac and of Pau, and adorned them with the famous library that she bequeathed to Fontainebleau, founded hospitals and orphanages throughout her kingdom. Margaret succored the poor, herself visiting the sick and consoling them. Finally, she made of this nook of southern France, always hostile to the power of Rome, and even now counting its Protestants by thousands, a refuge for whosoever was persecuted and whosoever was poor or oppressed. There was much need of such an asylum, for the hatred of the Sorbonne toward the new ideas became with every month more virulent and more capable. In the preceding year, 1529, Margaret herself, in continued supplication, had been unable to save Loy Berquin, a learned gentleman of Artois, from the stake. He had been burned alive, and the flames of this bonfire lit up many pale and scared faces throughout the whole of France. Roussel, Lefebvre, Calvin, Baduel, Daronde, all her old friends and her masters at Meaux, Marot, Desperriers, Antoine Hérouet, gay young poets and gallants in her service, suspected of heresy no less than she herself, all these and many others looked to Margaret in anxious appeal. In settling at Nérac, she made a welcome home for all of these. The children of her adoption and the children of her bearing had alike been taken from her. Margaret at Nérac received all that were exiled and all that were oppressed to be her sons and her daughters. Queen Margaret made the exiled Roussel Bishop of Oloron, though he preached in lay dress and in the tongue of the people. She had Lutheran services held in the castle. Calvin, Michel d'Arande, and Lefebvre she sheltered in her house. She paid the schooling of Baduel and other young divines. Her court was a home and refuge for all who fled the wrath of the Sorbonne. Clément Marot, poet and Lutheran suspect, who had been her secretary at Alençon, was made her gentleman of the chamber at Nérac, together with Bonaventure des Perriers, le joyeux Bonaventure, whose atheism had brought him into almost equal disrepute. Thus Nérac gradually became an asylum, not only for austere reformers, scholars, and thinkers, but for the lightest singers of airy badinage, the wittiest and most frivolous of men of letters. For all alike were suspected in the eyes of the Sorbonne, and as Melanchthon wrote, all students and all scholars having the title of Frenchmen put their natural hope in Her Majesty as in a divinity. But the court was not entirely made of theologians and poets, and was by no means a haunt of pedants alone. Many charming ladies, whose names we still remember, add a charm to the safety of that refuge. Ladies whom Marot celebrated in his clear, neat, crystalline verses. Ladies who, at Margaret's feet, presided over what was virtually the last of the old French courts of love. Hélène de Tournon, the beautiful and witty niece of the cardinal minister of Francis, the gentle Florette de Sarraz, whom Margaret loved and whose name alone remains to us, and fairest of all, Isabeau d'Albret, the sister of the king. Isabeau, cette fine mouche, whose white throat and large eyes, whose sweet manners and girlish queenliness are familiar to us even now, whose petit rire folâtre rings still through Marot's verse. Isabeau, whose love match with Monsieur de Rohan, an impoverished Breton noble, whose debts, disasters, and ruin made for many years the chief care of her kind and active sister-in-law. For it was Margaret who succored the charming, thoughtless girl in all her misfortunes, settled her affairs, sheltered her homeless head, and brought up her children as they had been her own. Margaret had helped the match between Isabeau and her lover, Monsieur de Rohan. To Margaret Francis applied whenever the necessity of the court required some difficult alliance, some rebellious young people to persuade, some ruthless parent to soften. She was a kindly matchmaker, and though she preached implicit obedience to authority, she would not interfere between lovers. "Between ourselves," she says, "we poor homely women understand not how to spoil such honest love." She was indeed the natural protectress of young people. Her niece Madeleine, in love with a king of Scotland, betrothed elsewhere; Isabeau de Rohan, falling from misfortune to misfortune till she becomes the poorest gentlewoman in France; Margaret of France, wan with grief for the death of her sister, the Scottish Queen; Mademoiselle d'Estouteville, refusing to marry a man who does not love her; the orphan Charlotte de Laval. All these young girls, and many others whose names and characters grow familiar to us through the letters of Margaret, are sheltered, as it were, under the folds of her mantle, as the virgins of Saint Ursula in the pictures at Cologne. In the refined artificial society of Nérac, old forms of gallantry survived and new ones were invented. For, with regard to gallantry, said Brantôme, this queen knew more about it than about her daily bread. The romantic, mystical temper of Margaret, who found no pleasure in the actual looseness of the times, was strongly attracted to these semi-chivalrous rites, which were the dangerous shadow of that laxity. The court of Nérac was a veritable puits d'amour. The heart, no less than the soul, was regent there, and though Margaret had no lovers, she had more brothers by alliance, sons by alliance, platonic enthusiasts, and adoring protégés than any other queen in Europe. Par alliance et acquis une sœur, qui en beauté, en grâce et en douceur, entre un millier ne trouve sa pareille. Aussi mon cœur à l'aimer sa pareille. Mais d'être aimé ne se tient pas bien sûr. And so my heart prepares to love her, but is not sure of being loved. This is the tenor of all contemporary verses rhymed to Margaret, whose bittersweet favours Jacques Pelletier deplored. Marot calls her in reproachful admiration la mal mariée qui ne veut faire amie, and his poems to her breathe a surprised respect. But though the Queen of Navarre was actually a very virtuous woman, we cannot but own that this dangerous atmosphere of Nérac, this subtle intermingling of mysticism and gallantry, did gradually vitiate the purity of her thoughts, and prepared the correspondent of Brisonnet to become the author of the Heptameron. The wife of Henry d'Albret, the unchilded mother of Jeanne, the absent sister of Francis, had need of such unsubstantial and flimsy affections to stuff an unsatisfied heart. The young King of Navarre, 11 years younger than his wife, was very early tired of conjugal fidelity. A vain, fluent, boastful creature, with the eloquent mediocrity of the Méridional, he was at once proud and jealous of the ascendancy of Margaret, and more than once it needed the interference of Francis to persuade this agile, talkative, brilliant young king, with his facile violence and his easy repentance, to treat his fated wife with due respect. But if the home of Margaret at Nérac was neither quite happy nor quite free from dangerous tendencies, it was a shelter for many who otherwise must have perished. Not entirely noble in itself, it was yet a radiating centre of benevolence and humanity. The Renaissance of letters, frightened from Paris by the fires of the Sorbonne, took shelter in the castle there, and when that refuge grew too dangerous, the mistress of Nérac gave her guests the means to travel to safer places, dispatching Marot to Ferrara, Calvin to Geneva, others whither was best for them, sending as much as 4,000 francs at once to the refugees in Switzerland. For all the artificial chivalry, the elderly philandering, which disfigured the purity of Nérac, it was truly the sojourn of honor. The young were safe there, the old were sheltered there. And this court of literary exiles was none the less the heart of its country. Thence justice and law, active benevolence, wealth and civilization were circulated through Béarn and Navarre, making of a half-savage kingdom a prosperous and happy place. And so this little court of Nérac persuades us that a movement, that a woman intrinsically a little artificial, lax and worldly, may none the less, by the sheer force of human tenderness, become the salvation of things nobler than itself. End of section 11. Section 12 of Margaret of Angoulême, Queen of Navarre, by Agnes Mary Frances Robinson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 9. The Sorbonne, 1529 to 1535, Part 1. No less at Fontainebleau than at Nérac, Queen Margaret was the patron of the Renaissance and the champion of the learned. She fostered the natural love of Francis for art and letters, and encouraged him to defy the restrictions and rigid dogma of the Sorbonne. Francis, who was sensitive to any interference with his kingship, was easily convinced that the Sorbonne lessened his authority by its presumption, and in such a mood his sister found it easy to persuade him to found a secular college in Paris to confer an eternal benefit on learning. Margaret was not alone in her endeavour. Jean du Bellay, the younger brother of the vigilant Guillaume and the wise Martin, was Cardinal of Paris. He was suspected of a leaning to reform. It was even said that, spite of his red hat, he was secretly married to Madame de Chatillon, the excellent governess of Margaret. He was a brilliant, adequate, and tolerant statesman and scholar. His influence, it is needless to say, with that of his two brothers, was ever thrown into Margaret's scale. The Renaissance in France had no more energetic champions than the three Du Bellairs. Guillaume Bude, the great Greek scholar, who on his wedding day lamented that he had but 6 hours left for study, was the librarian of Francis. Pedant as he was, narrow and dogmatic humanist, he was none the less devoted to the cause of learning. He did good work in the revival of letters. Among other scholars, says a contemporary, Bude shone as the sun among the stars. To him, to Jean du Bellay, to the Queen of Navarre, Michelet gives the triune glory of founding the Collège of France. This is a little hard on Francis, who already in 1521 was inspired with this idea. It is, however, safe to say that to these three persons belongs the honor of infusing into the volatile king sufficient energy and hardihood to make so fine a thought a deed. Margaret, Cardinal du Bellay, Bude, these were undoubtedly the guides and inspirers of Francis. But there was a whole public seconding them, demanding their succor, crying for safety and legality. Paris was full of men of learning, even as Fontainebleau of architects and painters. Etienne Ponchet, Bishop of Paris, Loise du Ruzet, a President of Parliament, were the leaders of a circle abounding in wisdom and enterprise. The Etienne, the learned printers whose wives and children could all speak Latin, to whom is due the New Testament of Lefebvre d'Etaples, the first book of the Reformation. These men, workmen and scholars, at once learned, heroic in their patience and labor, had gathered about them a society of humanists and doctors, to whom they submitted the text issued by their press. Lascaris the Greek, Oronce Finet the mathematician, Renanus the historian of Germany, Alexander Roconnet, Mousserous, Paul Paradis, Vatable, Toussaint, Donne, scholars and philologists. These men, who did for France what Pico and Politian did for Italy, gathered as round a sanctuary altar round this printing press of the Etienne. Through them, no less than through the humane Margaret, the brilliant Cardinal du Bellay, the profound Bude, it was rendered possible for Francis to found the Collège of France. The university was no shelter to men such as these. Graecum est non legitur, taught the Sorbonne. Cette langue enfante toutes les hérésies, preached the monks. And if Greek, the tongue of pagans, was forbidden, yet more intolerable was Hebrew, the language of the Jews. To shut France close within the narrow fold of Rome, ignorant of any tongue but her own, dreaming of no glory and no ideal but the supremacy of the Church, this was the aim of the Sorbonne. But the aim of the king was to throw wide every gate and break down every barrier, to open the East and welcome the learning of the Arab and the prowess of the Turk, to ransack the past for the guidance of the present, to establish a France which should face the glories of Greece and Rome and not be abashed, a France of palaces peopled with artists and scholars, splendid in battle, yet more redoubtable in her invincible peace, a Catholic France which, holding one hand to Soliman and the other to the heretic North, should reconcile humanity. For 8 years the king, a true Valois, audacious in conceiving, slow in the act, had revolved in his mind this glorious idea. In 1529, urged by Margaret and the scholars of her court, he gave it the first germ-like shape. No sooner was it founded than far and wide through Europe spread the fame of the brilliant secular Collège of France. Year by year, as its fame and its students increased, chairs and endowments were added to the first poor foundation. In 1529 the collège begins with a professor of Greek and one of Hebrew. That is all. By 1530, 2 chairs for Greek, 2 for Hebrew, 1 for mathematics. In 1534, Latin follows, medicine and philosophy in 1540. These are quickly succeeded by endowments for jurisprudence, for Arabic and Syriac. Physiology, the rights of man, the East, these are the doors opened by the new secular college. In these 12 years, the destiny of the genius of France is decided. The character of France has shown its bent. To this impulse the Sorbonne opposed itself with violence and fury. If we may believe our masters, says the contemporary Histoire ecclésiastique, to study Greek and to meddle, let it be never so little, with Hebrew is one of the greatest heresies of the world. And Henri Etienne, in his apology for Herodotus, complains that Greek and even Latin are esteemed luthéranifiques et hérétiques. To such an extent, he adds, that Master Beda, in the presence of King Francis, first of the name, retorted to the late Guillaume Boudet that Hebrew and Greek would be the source of many heresies. In this way, learning and science were tabooed as Lutheran. It is necessary to insist upon this point in order to understand the ferocity of the Sorbonne, in order to appreciate the motive which for the moment fused the Renaissance with the Reformation. These humanists and pioneers, for the most part Jewish or foreign of origin, professed the Reformed faith as an excuse for lax Catholicism. On the other hand, the most earnest souls in France looked to the new ideas as an escape from the degrading laxities, the soulless unmeaning of 16th century religion. They hoped for purification and reform in the Church itself, while the patriots desired to see the restriction of the temporal power of Rome. Both wished to decentralize the Church, to restore the Gallican branch to its old national position. All these different strains of dissent were firmly welded into one by the ignorant persecution of the Sorbonne. But this movement was not yet Protestant. It was still very practical, very undefined, little concerned with theories or ideas. "Thank heaven," cries Margaret, "we are none of us sacramentarians." To establish secular education, print the Bible in French, teach Greek and mathematics, sustain the Gallican branch, this is the programme of the movement, this and no actual schism. Briconnet, Roussel, the Du Bellets, Margaret did not desire or dream of a Church wholly severed from the Catholic authority. It was a sort of home rule which they demanded, to be Catholics, but Reformed and Gallican Catholics. It was in truth Calvin the Frenchman, Calvin the man of system and practice, and not Luther the German, the mystic and prophet, who organized and consolidated the Protestant Church. This point must never be forgotten in seeking to understand the history of Margaret of Angoulême. That life, else so hopelessly confused, so vacillating and effortless, becomes clear and definite when once we understand that not the Reformation but the Renaissance inspired it. Never was a spirit less dogmatic or insistent than hers. She was no martyr, no saint or prophetess. She was merely a woman filled by the new fervor for learning, the new reverence for knowledge, the renascent love for art and poetry, no less than for ideas and for science. Under one wing she sheltered Janet, Cellini, Marot, Desperriers, under the other Calvin and Vatable. Full of imagination and keen intelligence, instinct with compassion and liberality, her nature would have been as much revolted by narrow Protestant dogma as by Catholic tyranny. Read the contemporary Lutheran historians, and it is clear that the ignorance and brutal injustice were not entirely upon the side of the Sorbonne. Coarseness and violence were as rife at Geneva as at Paris, and Margaret would not have been happy in Calvin's city of God. She would have pitied Servetus as sorely as she pitied Lois de Berquin. Her rare and modern spirit would ill have understood that hard and fast salvation of Geneva, that satisfaction in the damnation of disbelievers. Human life, knowledge, tolerance, and freedom were dearer to her than any code or any creed. In fact, her code and her creed was her belief in these things, her practice of human kindness. Those dying words of hers, so hushed up, so indignantly refuted, express the principle of her life. What I have done, I did from compassion, not conviction. At this moment, let us remember, Calvin is still in France, a youth of 20. His Institutio is not written. Geneva is not yet a church. Protestantism still is undetermined. Margaret and her court of scholars personify the earlier, vaguer Reformation. Mystical and learned, eager to discover the secrets of heaven and earth, they were more anxious to learn than to proselytize, and the Collège of France is the church that they established. It is important to insist on this eclectic and cultured moment of the Reformation, because Margaret never outgrew it, and was condemned as an apostate by the later Protestants who had advanced, merely for standing still. On the other hand, exasperated by the growth of heresy, the court receded from its tolerant position, so that Margaret, who at this moment touches Calvin, as it were, on one hand, and the court on the other, is gradually left at equal distance from either, suspected on both sides of half-heartedness and heresy. This is indeed the climax of her influence, the most brilliant moment of her career. From among her servants and her masters are sought the staff of the Collège of France. Toussaint and Danne had taught her a little Greek. It is said that Paul Paradis had given her lessons in Hebrew. Henri Etienne was under her protection no less than Vatable, Lascaris, and Aleander. Marot, the Lutheran poet, her valet de chambre, is entrusted to rewrite in modern French the ancient masterpieces of the quickly growing language. She is the centre of the movement. The king himself is under her influence. The Sorbonne, made keen by hate and fear, raises its threatening head, observes, and considers how to strike. To strike was only self-preservation, so bold and rapid became the impulse toward reform. In December 1530, the Protestant princes of Germany entered into a league and signed the Treaty of Schmalkald. England was on the point of actual revolt from the Roman sway, and France seemed like to do as much. The Emperor, no less than the Sorbonne, dreaded lest Francis should join the Protestant League, for the new ideas received every encouragement in Paris, and in September 1531 it seemed as if the last check was removed with the death of Louisa of Savoy. While she had lived, the Catholic party had trusted to her influence on her son and daughter, who passionately loved her. But now the innovating Margaret, unrestrained by her mother, would sit sole in influence at the right hand of the king. For an end had come to the passionate life of Madame. Her genius for intrigue, her scheming avarice, her intense and active nature lay idle in the grave. She was loath to quit the stage on which she played so principal a part. All her sufferings had not reconciled her to the thought of rest. Constantly ill, never free from gout and colic, she was still resolved to act, to witness. But throughout the summer of 1531, Margaret's letters reveal to us the gradual wasting of the frame which contains this violent spirit. She is not yet so strong as I desire. Madame was yesterday so weak I feared she would have fainted. She is so variable. Margaret says no more than that in her fear to alarm her brother. But though she refrains from afflicting him more openly, she writes of nothing but her mother's health. Today she is better. She had a good night. She will certainly recover, yet, sometimes she seems so weak. Turning from the fierce history of those times in which Margaret's gentle name, like a wing-bound dove, is bandied as a missile from one party to another, there is nothing more pathetic than to open the volume of her letters, to read these lines breathing love and anxiety, from which all else is banished, all hint of speculation, all interest in great affairs, to perceive this Lutheran heretic, hushed, self-unconscious, gentle, sitting by the bedside of the Catholic mother she adores, and gazing with anguish into the paling, dying face. The death of Louisa gave a swift impetus to the movement of reform. In 1533, Robert Estienne printed his Latin Bible. In the same year, a cooper's son from Noyon, a certain young Chauvin, or Calvinus, as he Latinized the name, a Picard bourgeois, strong, hard, dogmatic, litigious, had composed a book, as yet only known in manuscript, the Institutio Christianae Religionis. It was audaciously dedicated to the king, and bore the motto, Non veni mittere pacem sed gladium. The rector of the Sorbonne preached a sermon by this young Calvin to his scandalized magisters. What? Was the heresy infesting their very stronghold? The imprudent rector had to fly for his life to Switzerland. A warrant was issued against him, another against the obnoxious Calvin, who, less agile, was run to earth at Angoulême. Now let the Lutherans and Zwinglians behold to what ends led their monstrous opinions. Parliament, Sorbonne, and all good Catholics prepared for the auto and the triumph, when at the last moment their prey was wrested from them. Margaret, the pernicious Queen of Navarre, threw herself down before the king and entreated his pardon for Calvin. It was granted. She was verily the head and front of the offending, this light-minded, mystical, learned young Queen of Navarre. At all costs she must be warned, crushed, superseded. A little before this she had published at Alençon a poem, weak, mystical, inflated with a vague ideality, Le Mirouet de l'âme pécheresse. It would be hard, in this mist of nebulous piety, to name precisely any error of commission, but the Sorbonne, supremely irritated against Margaret, discovered therein diverse heresies of omission. There was no mention of the saints in it, neither of purgatory, the prayer to the Virgin, the Salve Regina was paraphrased in honor of Jesus Christ. Here the prompt and aggressive Beda perceived his opportunity. In the next index of the works forbidden to the faithful, the Sorbonne published the title of The Mirouet de l'âme pécheresse. End of section 12. Section 13 of Margaret of Angoulême, Queen of Navarre, by Agnes Mary Frances Robinson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 9. The Sorbonne, 1529 to 1535, Part 2. All this took place in 1533. Francis, ever devoted to his sister, still devoted to the cause of progress and tolerance, ruminating an alliance with Soliman and the Protestant League, was thunderstruck with indignation. He sent for the rector of the Sorbonne and ordered a complete list to be made of those magisters who had composed the index. He caused the Bishop of Senlis to defend the work before the University, which meekly retracted its accusation. The occasion was made into a triumph for Margaret. Beda and his party were not silenced yet. A few weeks after this, the students and 4 professors of the Theological College of the Navarrene Fathers at Paris publicly performed a farce in the great hall of the building. Margaret was the heroine of this ingenious representation. In the first act she is represented as leaving her spindle and letting fall her distaff to accept from an infernal fury a French translation of the four Gospels. Margaret then becomes herself a fury, a spirit of controversy and bitterness, devoured by insensate tyranny, infected with the cruelty of hell. Such was the movement of the play, such the portrait of the endearing and sweet-hearted sister of the king. Francis was terribly incensed. He sent the four Navarrene fathers to the prison of the Conciergerie, whence only at Margaret's most earnest intercession they were after some days set free. Beda suffered at greater length. Suspicious either that the farce was performed at his instigation, or else that he was actually the author of it, the king sentenced the combative syndic to 2 years of exile. The Sorbonne was in despair. It did indeed appear impossible to assail this high-throned heretic. Moreover, the exile of Beda struck their weapon from their hands. For a while all was quiet. Then an event occurred to set the Protestants hopelessly in the wrong. Whether laid in train by the coarser and more blundering reformers, or the fruit of unscrupulous Catholic zeal, none may decide. During the night of the 18th of October, 1534, the doors of the cathedral and town halls of Paris, Rouen, Meaux, and other cities, even to the gates of the castle of Amboise, where was the king, were covered with placards assailing in the grossest terms the mysteries of the Catholic faith, denying the Mass, the Host, the prayers for the dead, whatever was held most mystical and sacred. Nothing could be more brutal than the feeling which prompted this offence, unless it be the feeling which punished it. All that was tender and holy was publicly outraged here: the mysterious sacrifice of the Mass, the faith that rescued the dear but sinful dead from the pains of purgatory. More than this, in Paris there stood an image of the Mother and Child, held especially venerable and beloved. Many prayers were addressed to this succorable Madonna. Her image in the public street brought to the roughest heart a reminder of gentleness and purity. This dawn of the 19th of October shone upon a desecrated shrine. The head of the Virgin, the head of the babe, had been rudely chopped from the trunks and lay fallen and mutilated in the gutter. When the king heard of it, he burst into tears. That cruel blunder, that heartless revenge, lost the cause of the reform. Many a stake should smoke, and many a rack should strain and creak, in expiation of that murdered stone. This affair of the placards sent a horror pulsing throughout the length and breadth of France. It frightened from the reform its gentler and more reverent adherents. Margaret herself, ever compassionate, felt it necessary to declare her Catholicism to the world. Francis henceforth became no less combative than the Sorbonne itself. He set out at once for Paris to sift the matter. No sooner had he reached the capital when, in the space of a single night, the placards burst out again in hideous flower. They were on all the buildings, all the churches. Even into the king's cabinet they brought their obscene and scurrilous defiance. A vague fear and horror took possession of the town. All through France throbbed that sense of outraged pity for the murdered Redeemer, which lay at the bottom of medieval persecution, blent with that maddening terror of supernatural evil, which gave their keenest edge to the cruelties that punished witchcraft. Heresy was indeed a sort of witchcraft, a spell wasting the souls of men before the fires of hell, even as the grosser witches knew how to make men's bodies melt and wane. It is difficult now to place ourselves in this attitude, yet unless we do so, we can never understand the lesson of the past. When the king heard of the Virgin's mutilated image, he burst, as I have said, into tears. But his anger was not to end in weeping. a severe inquiry was instituted, and all accused of complicity in this matter were brought to Paris and tried there. The party of the Sorbonne pretended that they had discovered a Protestant plot to murder all good Catholics while at Mass. Nothing can be less founded than such a charge, obviously trumped up to secure a conviction. Without it, the conviction was secure. 24 of the accused were sentenced to be burnt to death. On the 29th of January, 1535, a great expiatory procession traversed Paris from the Louvre to the Church of Notre Dame. The king walked in this procession bareheaded, holding in his hand a lighted torch. He was followed by his children and the flower of his court. His beautiful mistress was there with Queen Leonor and many fair and joyous ladies, but Margaret had returned to Navarre. She had left Paris heavy-hearted some weeks before, seeing, as it seemed, all her dreams of wide culture, beneficence, and toleration crumble suddenly into nothing, and the old reign of darkness engulf the world once more. Indeed, on that morning of the 21st of January, 1535, the Renaissance, the Collège of France, the treaty with the Turks, appeared shocking and anomalous, for Paris had returned to medievalism. It might have been Louis XI, and not King Francis, who walked there bareheaded, holding his lighted torch. To the sound of solemn chants, the procession wound through the streets. Not only the court was there, and the king and queen, and the 200 gentlemen of the royal household, but the whole Sorbonne, triumphant over the absent Queen of Navarre. The clergy of Paris, the Swiss guards, the heralds, the court of Parliament, the municipality, the guilds of capital, the courts of the realm. It was a procession of several thousand persons, all alike in their pity and their burning indignation, that marched from the Louvre to Notre Dame. When we realize this, we understand the sequel. We understand how little yet, for all its brilliant veneer of culture, France was impregnate with the true modern spirit. The Middle Ages were reared up close behind, and their tremendous shadows fell across that world to darken it. At Notre Dame there was High Mass, thence the procession moved to the Bishop's Palace, where, seated on a throne, the king addressed the multitude. In his words, burning, thrilling with medieval passion, we catch no echo of the familiar speech of the father of letters. The debonair, free-thinking dilettante of the Renaissance has disappeared. The mutilated image of the Virgin has roused in his place the latent fanatic, present ever behind the most modern shows of the double-natured 16th century. Louis the Saint or Louis the Cruel might have spoken as he spoke. So easily a strong passion refutes the painful progress of centuries. The multitude stood in the hall, and in the court outside the king on his raised throne spoke to them, the tears in his eyes. He spoke of the blasphemy and profanation, and of that day's expiation. He denounced the enemies of God and the Church. And if my own right arm, he cried at last, were infected with this heretic pestilence, I would cut it off and cast it from me. And if one of my own children were so miserable as to favor it, I would with my own hand sacrifice him to God's justice and my own. Ominous words for the absent and suspected Queen of Navarre. The Sorbonne, listening, must have triumphed, for those wise magisters did not yet know how volatile were the moods of their brilliant king. For the moment there was no more fiery Catholic than Francis. He went himself with the ladies of his court, with the fervent, outraged Leonor and the laughing Madame d'Etampes, to see them light the pile where 6 of the accused would suffer that evening. Throughout December the autos had flamed and smoked. Already 10 Lutherans had died that winter at the stake. In general they suffered singly, but to honor so tremendous an occasion no less than 6 could die. 3 Lutherans, says the bourgeois of Paris, and a clerk of the Châtelet, and a fruiterer, and the wife of a cobbler, and a schoolmaster. This last for eating meat on Fridays. These were to be the victims. They were fastened by long iron chains to a lofty gibbet, and swung to and fro in and out of the burning fire. Madame d'Etampes is said to have complained of the sickening odor of the burning flesh, of the horrible sight of the convulsed and blackened bodies. Poor easy-natured Anne de Pisseleu, yourself suspected of Lutheran leanings, the spectacle may well have turned you faint with fear and horror. But the bourgeois of Paris does not mention the presence of the king at the actual sacrifice. The court, I incline to believe, turned home before it came to that. Throughout the spring the stakes were constantly piled, the gibbets swing their smoking freight to and fro, and whereas in the earlier months the victims were humble and ignorant folk, as time goes on we note a richer prey. In November, a cobbler's son, a printer, a mason, a tailor, a young servant. In such wise run the entries. But in the spring, a rich merchant from 50 to 60 years of age, estimé homme de bien, a goldsmith, a painter, a young Italian merchant, a scholar, one of the king's choristers, an attorney. Here it is the middle class that is attacked. Nor was this all. Not only life but reason was menaced. On the 26th of February, the king suspended the action of the press. No more books were to be printed, so ordained the friend and patron of the Estiennes, the founder of the Collège of France. But the thing was impossible. France could no longer live, work, pursue her daily affairs without the press. Not only Jean du Bellay and the learned Bude, but even the reactionary Parliament protested against so grotesque a prohibition. The king was content with imposing a censorship of the press. So completely had Francis turned upon his steps. Perhaps we find the reason in the fact that Beda, the intrepid Beda, returned from exile in 1535, accused the king himself of leaning toward heresy. Francis threw the rash syndic into prison again, obliged him to do public penance in a sheet and holding a candle, finally confined him in the prison of Mont Saint-Michel, where the cutting winds and stormy weather of the ensuing spring cooled forever the fiery heart of Beda. But Francis, though avenged, was not appeased. A horror of his own laxity was upon him. Still the persecution continued, till finally the Protestants of Germany complained of his rigor toward unfortunates whose only crime was professing the religion which they themselves, the king's allies, believed. They also deplored the rumored alliance between Francis and Soliman. The king's answer has been preserved. He, to some extent, admits a friendly intention toward the Porte, acknowledging that he had received the Turkish ambassador. The emperor, he reminds them, had done as much, and it is well to abstain from war with the Turk. As for the penalties he had, against his will and nature, inflicted on his Lutheran subjects, it was rather their sedition than their religion which he had punished. So little objection had the king to the convictions of his allies that he would willingly receive any theologian that they might choose to send to his court. This is in the summer of 1535. Another wind blows, and the weathercock king has veered from his pathos and horror of January. On the eve of a new war with the emperor, Francis desires to conciliate the German princes. His keen and subtle political instinct recalls him from the dreary paths of Spain. End of Section 13.